Let's get inspired with today's inspiring mind, Angela T. Smith. Angela Thompson Smith, Ph.D., is the Director of Mindwise Consulting in Boulder City, Nevada. Dr. Smith has 30-plus years experience in the parapsychology and conscientious fields, including 5 years working at the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research, PEAR, laboratory, and 25 years in the remote viewing field as a trainer and consultant. Dr. Smith is the author of numerous books and is a founding member and director of the International Remote Viewing Association, IRVA. Welcome, Angela.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on your show.
That's a long list and a very, very nice experiences that I'm sure you've put together over these years. What really started this whole path for yourself? Where it all began?
As a child, I had out-of-body experiences, and I thought everybody did this, that they went flying off and exploring places. And sometimes they were spontaneous. Sometimes I could go where I needed to go. And when I asked my family, they said, no, you must be dreaming. But I knew I wasn't dreaming. It was while I was still awake. And then over the years, that developed into a serious interest in parapsychology, human consciousness, and eventually it ended up here, where I was trained in remote viewing, which is the formal now, the accepted name for flying off and looking at different places around the world.
Right. When you spoke about out of body experiences, what was the first feeling like, and how did you know it was a different experience than most other people were feeling? Like, who was the first person you shared this information with?
Well, my mother. I would be put to bed, and in England in the summer, it stays very light until about 10 or 11 o'clock at night. So I wasn't tired to go to sleep. So I would sit up in my bedroom window or on my bed, and I would just send my mind wherever, like I would go to my grandmother's house and wander around and see what she was doing in the same village where I grew up. Or I'd wander around the village and I'd look at different things. I'd go and sit up on the roof with my mind and look around. But as I said, when I told my mother, she said, well, you've got a good imagination. You must be dreaming. Because I thought it was like dreaming, similar to dreaming, in that everybody could do this and nobody really talked about it.
Right.
Until my 20s and 30s, where I started really researching, because I learned it wasn't a common thing. And what I was doing wasn't shared by everybody.
Was there any type of stigmatism attached to the to having these gifts or these talents?
Not really. England is a lot more open than America, so hunches, dreams, all of those things, precognitive stuff is all pretty much accepted, particularly by my family, who had seen UFOs, and they felt they knew about gut hunches, but people just didn't talk about them. They would say, my grandmother in particular would say, oh, I dreamed about Auntie Mary. And then she said, Auntie Mary's sick. And she'd find out that Auntie Mary was really sick. So I think I got I don't call it a gift, but I got what I got from, I think, my paternal grandmother.
But she had the same skills or talents.
I think so, but she didn't really talk about it. But having looked back at her life, I think she did, yes.
Yeah, and when was the first time you were able to actually use these skills to your advantage?
Not until my 30s, because I did a lot of personal research in between. I had friends who also shared these experiences. It was at Manchester University, where I was working as a research nurse. And so I was going to an evening class, Outer Limits of the Mind, and met up with some like-minded people. And we set up a little research project where if they were going on vacation or going somewhere different, they would, I would try and, we didn't call it remote viewing then, I would try and see where they were, what they were doing. And then when they came back, they'd give me some feedback and I'd check to see if I was correct.
Right.
And so there were lots of times where I was able to tell them things that puzzled them during their visit. And I'd say, oh, I saw that man and he was walking a dog. And they said, oh, we thought he had a dog, but we never saw it. So there was that kind of validation.
Right, right. You also worked as a nurse, correct?
I trained as a nurse in England. I joined when I was 18. England has a different system. So it's for 3 years on the job training. And then I went on to do social work training and ended up in New Brunswick, New Jersey, working as a research coordinator at the Institute for Child Health, and working with moms and babies at the local hospital, testing what we called laterality development. Babies have sidedness when they're born. They have a preference for turning their head one way or the other, and people think that this predicts whether they're going to be right or left-handed. So this is what we were studying at UMDNJ.
Okay. And where was the shift from coming from England to America? What was the motivation for you making this
That
journey or
was,
this trip here?
yeah, that was in the early 1980s. And it was actually to come and marry. I had met an American years ago before that. And I didn't come to get a green card or citizenship or anything like that. This was just to marry and to be a mother because he had two small children. So, but that didn't turn out too well.
Right.
So I've done everything since.
Okay. So what was it, 1981 when you came to the States?
Right, yes.
Okay. And you, when did you first get into remote viewing? When did you start experimenting?
I got into remote viewing at the PEAR lab. It was called something a little different. It was called remote perception at the PEAR lab to differentiate it from what was being researched at Stanford Research Institute. And at PEAR, well, I was working at UMDNJ and read an article about some research that was taking place in Princeton, some at Princeton University and some at another small lab called the Psychophysical Research Labs at Princeton Junction. And so I would go down on my days off and holidays and participate as a volunteer. And at one point they said, would you like to work here? And I went, yes, because my research job at the university was finishing, the grant was finishing. So I was wondering, what am I going to do? And along comes this opportunity to work at a parapsychology lab. So that was just amazing.
What was the experience like? What did you actually do there? I mean,
I did a bit of everything. I was hired on basically to be an assistant to Brenda Dunn, who was the lab manager at the time. But over the 5 years, I participated in everything, including the experiments, the studies that were going on. So I participated in the remote perception work, the human-computer interaction work, everything that was new, wherever they needed beta testers, the staff always participated.
well, in terms of discovering the term remote viewing, when was the first time that you actually heard of this or actually could associate your own perceptions to a specific, I guess, title as a remote viewer?
Well, back in the late 1970s, when I was still at Manchester, when I discovered that it was something that I could do that not everybody could do. I started researching, and I read the first book I read was Robert Monroe's book about, and he started up the Monroe Institute in Charlotte in North, yeah,
North
it's
Carolina.
in
So,
yeah, Virginia,
oh, okay.
and
Okay.
yeah, and I he had out of body experiences. He was an engineer, and he explored these experiences and discovered this was something he could control, and that he could actually lay down conditions for how to initiate it in himself. So I was reading his work and thinking, wow, here's another person that can do what I can do. And I just swallowed up that book. And then I went into a voracious reading cycle. And it was really interesting looking at all the other work, because this is not a new skill. This has been around for centuries, as you
Right.
know. Um, but we're just now supposedly just rediscovering it and giving it a new title, remote viewing.
What input did Russell Targ have on remote viewing? I mean, what was his responsibility? If you could explain maybe about the Stargate
Well, Russell Targ was not involved with Stargate, but he was working with Hal Puthoff at Stanford Research Institute in the 70s.
right.
And they had a lab there that was studying what they termed remote viewing. And the term was actually coined by Ingo Swann and Dr. Janet Mitchell in New York at the American Society for Psychical Research. And Ingo Swann took the term to Stanford, where a very large research project was started, headed by Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff. And then they brought in, I think they had over 200 research participants over the years.
Interesting. And I mean, I don't know if people have heard of it. If someone has never heard the term remote viewing, since we're discussing that, how would you describe that in layman's terms to somebody, you know?
Well, I like the Stanford definition, which they said was what used to be called out-of-body experiences, dissociation, etc., etc. Okay, I'll ignore that.
Yeah.
Now we're calling all these old terms, we're now calling remote viewing, because as it's a neutral term, it's got rid of all the connections to everything that's past, because there's always been a bit of a taboo about out-of-body experiences and other human consciousness abilities. We're now calling this remote viewing, and that's in late 70s was where this came in.
Now, from my understanding, I mean, the military and the U.S. government had its hands on this type of remote viewing. Could you describe a little bit about the
Yeah. Inga Swan had been working with Stanford Research Institute for a while. And another definition, which I didn't mention, was it's the ability to access and report on locations, people, things, events that are occurring at a distance that are shielded from ordinary perception.
the five senses, basically?
Or sensing, yeah.
Okay.
And shielded from the five senses. So the military became interested, the army particularly. And there was at the time, it was thought that the Russians were ahead of America in terms of psychic research. It turns out that wasn't the case. They were both battling each other. One would be ahead. It was like a race almost.
Right.
Yeah. So the Army set up a unit at Fort Meade called, it ended up as the Stargate unit, at Stargate, 2 words. And it had several names, code names before that, Grill Flame, etc. And what they did was they brought in, they recruited soldiers and airmen and others to come into the unit and to train. Some of them trained with Ingo Swann, including my trainer, Paul Smith. And Ingo and Hal Puthoff developed this wonderful protocol called controlled remote viewing, where you go through certain stages and you don't even have to think about, oh, I'm going to go get the information. You're just accessing your subconscious, and it's your subconscious that's going out getting the information. So as you go through these written and voiced stages, you're accessing more and more and deeper information about the target. We call it the target. It's wherever you're trying to go and find information about, say, a missing person or an event, a disaster, or stock market. So it's everything came out of the Stargate unit, which eventually closed down because there was some dissension about who was going to run it and who was going to fund it, and eventually it closed. And then the Stargate participants then went out and started training other people in the community, training civilians.
Interesting. Now, there is a difference between extended remote viewing and controlled remote viewing. If you could just
extended remote viewing, or ERV, is a more natural, close your eyes, travel to the location, a little bit OBE-like, and bring back information, whatever's perceived, and then write it down or record it. It's not done in any particular schematic kind of way or protocol way, except that it's done, usually done blind, which means you don't know where you're going. You just get an address of a target, which is called a coordinate. And that's not a latitude, longitude. It's like a alphanumeric ABC 1, 2, 3 coordinate. And so that's a more natural stream of consciousness type of remote viewing. Controlled remote viewing is the military method that was developed by Hal Puthoff and Ingo Swann. Right. And that is a very formal, sequential, written and spoken protocol. And there are the person who trained me, Paul Smith, he is the gold standard for this. So he is the person, if you want to know controlled remote viewing or CRV in depth, go to see Paul. I train a modified version of it for applications work. So I'll have people come in for a weekend. They get thrown in the deep end. They get enough CRV to bring them up to speed. So on the third day, they can actually work on a real project, like the Notre Dame fire, for example, or the riots in Paris, and see what they perceive.
Are there situations where controlled RV can bring up the same results as an extended RV session?
Yeah, I think both methods can access very similar information. What I think of ERV as a more lateral remote viewing. It's wider in scope. So you can go in and bop around and see whatever you can get. With CRV, it's a more linear process. So there are different approaches, but they go to the same location to get similar information.
Interesting. Now, you've been involved in many interesting subjects and topics with regards to remote viewing. Could you just discuss one of the cases that stands out to you that you'd like to discuss?
I think the most important one, I have written about many of these cases in Seer, my book Seer, was the Denver DJ murder case. And I'll explain briefly about that. I had a colleague who at one of the conferences, the remote viewing conferences, said, I've got a project for you. I'm going to give you a coordinate, do your thing, and then get back to me. So I'm not a psychic or a medium. I don't do on the spot telephone stuff or give people information in person. I go home, I sit down with this alphanumeric and do my session. And for this, I did I did some ERV and CRV combined. And what I found was, what I perceived was this water. It was brackish water. It was near an estuary. It was near land. But there was an event. There was probably a death, etc. So I got back to my colleague, my friend, and I told him what I'd perceived. And he said, no, no, no. He said, this is my friend. He said, he's been missing for 4 weeks and we want to know where he is. I said, well, that's what I see. This is the data I get. So he said, well, can you get some other remote viewers to do it as well? So I have a small group of volunteer remote viewers around the country that I can call on. They're like a volunteer firefighting group. I contacted some of those and I gave them the coordinate. They came back with very similar information about this body in the water, and an event, a sad event that had happened, etc., and a lot of other information. I gave this again to my colleague, and he said, well, he said, if that's what the viewers are getting, he said, we'll just have to wait and see. But when he was out in LA, he and his wife were watching TV, and it was a program, it was a news program about a body that had been fished up off of Catalina Island, that had been in the water for some time. And they said, oh, this is all the information that the remote viewers gave us. It validates all the information. So that must be our friend. So they contacted the LA Sheriff's Office, and they contacted the Catalina Island morgue and tried to give them information. They were thought of as suspects for a while because they knew too much. And they had to get validation from colleagues that they were okay. They knew who this guy was that was fished up out of the ocean, particularly because he was missing fingers from one of his hands, which only the colleague knew. So we had to sort of stay quiet for a while all the investigation was going on. Then we were asked to give a profile of the murderer. And then when they actually discovered him, he disappeared and they wanted to know where he went. I had perceived an island shape which looked like the tip of England, but it wasn't England, which turned out to be Tortola Island down in the Bahamas, where this man who was the murderer had the offshore banking. So he was eventually caught in Montana, just through other means. We didn't actually help catch him eventually, but our information was very helpful in, proving a case against him. And it turned out he did go to trial, and for 6 years while the trial was ongoing, we were not allowed to talk about the case, write about the case, or allude to the case even. We just had to, I just put it in the back of my mind and told my viewers, just forget about it for now. But when the case went through the trial, and he was found guilty, he was sentenced to life. And so he had actually taken the DJ out on his boat, shot him, and he went overboard. So we got a lot of validation when we got all the feedback.
When you were in the process of going through this remote viewing, how long did all this information flood into you, or how long did it take? Like, how long would a session?
The individual sessions can only take about an hour, but we did a lot of sessions, and that data accumulated. So it was about 8 years in total of collecting all this information and then not talking about the case for 6 years.
How do coordinates assist with a remote viewing session?
In the
How would you
beginning,
describe that?
yeah, in the beginning at Stanford, when they were just bringing in remote viewing, they used they used geographical coordinates, latitude and longitude. So they would give a latitude and longitude to a viewer, and then they would do their thing and go to the location and come back with the information. And then a geologist, I believe, said, well, if you give me a latitude and longitude, I can tell you what's there because that's my field. So they then went to what we're calling encrypted coordinates. They put the latitude, longitude into a computer, and it came out with a random series of letters and numbers. And they gave that to the viewers, and they got as good information as with the latitude, longitude. How that works, who knows? It's one of those mysteries. Now we use coordinates that are just random. I go into the computer, I get a bunch of random letters and numbers, and I'll assign 3 letters, 3 numbers to a particular location or event or target. And then I just give that coordinate then 1, 2, 3 ABC to the viewers.
Interesting.
Yeah.
What is the high strangeness RV? How would
I call it high strangeness because I'd heard that term. It refers to anything off planet or to do with ghosts and ghoulies or strange places, historical enigmas, anything that's out of the ordinary. And for many years, high strangeness remote viewing was kind of taboo in the remote viewing field. It was strictly for viewing events and locations, maybe people, if you're looking for missing people. In fact, Ingo Swann did a lot of high strangeness remote viewing. Ingo Swann was the inception of, he brought about remote viewing. Jupiter, he remote viewed Jupiter, he remote viewed the moon, did a lot of other out of the ordinary remote viewing. I also did a little bit of high strangeness remote viewing on my own, out of the box remote viewing, so to speak. It was not orthodox remote viewing. The whole situation has changed now. And over the last, I think, primarily because of Hal Puthoff being involved with the Stars Academy and working towards the validation and disclosure of the UFO phenomenon. So now, last November, I went down to Laughlin and actually gave a talk on remote viewing and high strangeness, off-planet remote viewing at a conference, a UFO conference, and Paul Smith also was there. So now the remote viewers are merging into the UFO field, which is very interesting.
It's interesting. Is that my voice? I don't know. Okay. No, I heard something. It's interesting because I was in your book, Seer, I was reading about the Rings of Saturn project in 1994. And yes. I found that very interesting. If you could just speak a little bit about that. That was something that stood out to me as something interesting.
Yeah. At that time, I was doing some consulting work for a group in California, Intuition Services. And they tasked me. This wasn't what we call blind tasking because they wanted to give me some non-leading questions that they didn't know the information about. And it was regarding the Rings of Saturn, and it was focused on Berglund's book, The Ring Makers of Saturn, which I had never read, I didn't even know about, and they didn't tell me about. So I did a remote viewing session. It was ERV, the more stream of consciousness remote viewing. going through their questions one at a time. And basically, they wanted to know, were there any anomalies in the rings? Were there, how did the rings form? How would they end? A lot of information. And again, I've put that into Seer. And one of the interesting things that I saw were mining craft in the rings of Saturn. They were longish and almost sort of tubular, and they were just static. They were not manned, and they were like filters, like a whale goes through the ocean and filters out the plankton. These craft were filtering out minerals, and every now and again another little craft would come and unload what was there and take it off somewhere else. So I mentioned this, and what I see, I never censor what I see, or I try not to censor what I see, and I just write it down, I give it to the client, and they make of it whatever they will. So that information about the mining craft was sort of dormant for a couple of decades until there was a craft that went out to Saturn, the Cassini craft.
That was in 2004.
Started sending back pictures. And then somebody on the internet took some of those pictures and blew them up. And there were the craft. They weren't called craft, they were just called anomalies in the scientific world. And nobody knew what they were. So it took 11 years and then another up till 20 years, a total of 20 years to get that feedback. So sometimes you just have to be patient.
Is the stalling, is the process stalled as a way of diminishing the work that's done so as not to associate it with the work of remote viewing in over time? In other words, you're doing the work, but certain forces or certain agencies may be holding the information back so as to,
I'm sure there's some censure at some point.
Yeah.
They don't ignore, NASA does not publicly recognize or refer to remote viewers or remote viewing. Although I have done remote viewing, for NASA, not officially, but for people that have approached me from NASA off record.
That was my next question. I think it was in 2002, one of the defects on the space shuttle.
Right.
Can you talk about that?
That was the one that exploded on re-entry.
Correct.
And which was devastating to watch because we had been tasked by a manager about maybe, 6 months or so before, and about some of the defects in the O-rings and cracks. There were micro cracks occurring.
Just one thing, when you say tasked, what do you mean tasked?
Tasked means that I was given the project by a manager. So it basically, that's just the terminology. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I did my remote viewing. I always do my remote viewing first before I give it out to any of the other remote viewers, the Nevada Remote Viewing Group. And what came back was that even one of the viewers mentioned the shuttle. So this was blind. All they got was a coordinate, a random coordinate. And what the outcome was, so one of the questions was, if nothing is done to remedy these defects, what will the outcome be? So what came back, what was deduced was that if this was not remedied, it would be disastrous.
Wow.
The manager told me he tried to interest higher ups with this information. And he said he just met like a stone wall. They didn't want to know because it's associated with, remote viewing is still associated with storefront psychics. It's not viewed as a scientific discipline. And then when I heard about the shuttle exploding, and saw pictures on TV. I was like, oh my gosh, you know, how awful. What am I going to say to this poor manager? You can't call, you can't email and go, I told you so.
Right,
We
right, right.
told you. You can't do
Right.
that. You have to have compassion. And so I just wrote with commiserations and saying how sorry I was to see that. And he said, well, he had tried. He had tried to alert people. So sometimes you get some good results from a remote viewing project, you know, finding the missing person or helping a situation. But sometimes it doesn't, it turns out sadly.
Yeah. All right. Shifting away from the space program or what happened with the shuttle, you started to write a book about voices from the cosmos, and you started to contact alien life with the not the assistance of somebody, I assume, but you were tasked in speaking or making communication with alien life and the different races that exist. Um, could you speak about that?
Sure. um, this was not something that I initiated on my own at the time. Um, Back in the early 2000s, I was working for a businessman, a New York Fifth Avenue businessman, and this was not who we think of as this was a private individual, and we had been doing remote viewing work on his business and some of his personal interests. And he said one day he would call me up and I would sort of offer my ear and he would just download all of his thoughts and, you know, and then out the blue, he would say something like, do you think you can talk to the aliens? And I said, well, he said, could you remote view? Could you use remote viewing for that? I said, well, I'd have to look up a protocol for that or develop a protocol for that. But I think so. Um, so I looked at interview processes that were, if you went out into the Amazon to remote view an indigenous race, a group of people that had just a minimal input from knowledge of white civilization or civilization in, you know, the bigger world,
Right.
um, what kinds of questions would you ask them? So I adapted those, and I said, well, I've got a protocol now. Where do we start? He said, well, I want you to talk to 5 different races for a start: large gray, small gray, the reptilians, the Nordics, and a hybrid, a Nordic hybrid. So I said, okay, well, I'll start with just one and we'll see where it goes. So I went into this very skeptically, and I'm thinking, yeah, right, you know, this is going to be a total bust. So I typed up all the questions into my computer. I didn't do this with anybody else. It was just me and them. So if they were going to answer. So I sat down in front of the computer with the questions up, hands on the keyboard, and I got into my remote viewing zone, which is not a trance state. It's just a
Right.
quiet, receptive state. And said, okay, is there a small gray of representative that would like to talk to me? And I got a response. And I'm going, oh, okay. Started writing down all the answers. It was like being on a roller coaster. Once you're on it, you know, you can't get off. You have to stay on for the duration.
Right.
Why I know, people have said to me, well, how do you know you weren't making this up? It was because some of the questions the answers I didn't even understand. And I had to ask clarifying questions.
Such
And
as what was some of the
um, they said things like abductions are beneficial to humans, which is
in
not
what
my,
sense? Yeah.
they felt that they created hybrids that went out as ambassadors all over the world, all over the universe, and that we should feel grateful and think of it as a positive experience. And that's not been my thoughts at all. So that was totally alien to me. And there were lots of things like that, things that they said that humans are not ready yet, that, we're really not developed enough to learn a lot of the things that they could teach us.
I think you used the word limited.
Limited, yes. They use the word limited. Yeah.
And which of the alien races stood out to be the most powerful or the most significant to you?
I like the Nordics. The Nordics, they seem very wise, very egalitarian. They work with a lot of the other races, and they were very willing to share and talk to me, whereas some of the other races, like for example the reptilians, didn't really want to talk to me, but I persisted because I'm quite stubborn. So I really like I like the Nordics.
What implications does knowing about alien life, what does it do for us as a human race? I mean, many people are afraid of dealing with that or even bringing up the subject.
Yeah, what I gleaned from over the year when we were working with these interviews was that they have been here forever visiting Earth. They consider the Earth as co-inhabitors, that they're in and out of our space all the time. And people, they're there. I mean, people say, "Oh, I saw a UFO," and I went, "Yeah, so."
Right.
Yeah. So I think, this thinking that we are it, that this little blue dot in the cosmos is it. We are the only sentient beings in the universe, that's limited.
Yes.
And the fact that there's so much more out there, that's very freeing and very opening. It's a little threatening to some people, but it's very, very mind opening.
When you did the interviews, did you see the races themselves, or did you hear? What was the sense that you
I didn't see or hear them. This was a sense of as if I was sitting in front of somebody and interviewing them. But there was maybe a screen in front, so it was just somebody on the phone and a phone interview. It was not an auditory voice. This was very much a telepathic auditory, which is different than actually hearing somebody with sound waves. But I could clearly hear, in quotes, what was being said, and I was able to record it. I later on did a few site visits with some of the later races. So I actually did see some of them and recorded the living conditions, etc. And those are more later in the book, which eventually I wrote up with C.B. Scott Jones, Dr. C.B. Scott Jones, and called Voices from the Cosmos, which we wrote in 2014.
Your new book, Scribe, will be coming out this spring, 2020?
Yeah, I'm hoping. I'm still working. I'm about halfway through. So Seer was 30 years of remote viewing from around 1983, right up to 2013. And now I'm taking you from 2013 up to 2020 with cases and projects, making as many as I can make public. There are some where I signed non-disclosures, or they've been proprietary to a particular client who've asked me not to talk about the cases. But as many as I can, I put into Seer. Now I'm going to put the rest into Scribe.
Is this something that you've not remotely viewed yet, but you'd like to? Do you have something in
Oh, wow.
in the works?
I'd like to do more off-planet remote viewing. I'd love to. We had to finish up the ET work because the client at the end of the year came under surveillance, which pretty much scared him back into doing just remote viewing about his business.
Right.
You know, he was videotaped out in public. He had a lot of intrusion into his life. But I would like to get back into doing some more of that kind of work, and also off-planet viewing, you know, new, like the new, what they call the new Earths, planets where, you know, have similar conditions to Earth. But it needs funding and it needs a client. It needs clients, people who are interested in doing this.
What are
And
your
there are
thoughts
lots of
on?
remote. Oh.
Yeah, I was going to ask you what your thoughts on Mars were in terms of.
We remote viewed a race that lives on, right? When we did the interviews, there was the RAL, a group that lives underground. And I also gave this as a project to some of my students who came up with very similar information. And one of the interesting things was when I talked to the RAL, I'd say talk to, I interviewed the RAL, one of the questions was asked about the rovers, the Mars rovers.
Right.
And they said, well, we thought they were gifts. Somebody had left us gifts because some of the rovers, early rovers, disappeared. They don't know where they went until the RAL realized that these were from elsewhere and they were actually from a sentient race, us. And, you know, so they didn't bother taking them anymore.
Is there water on Mars underground?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
That's what they told us. Yeah.
And do they come visit us? Does this race come to?
No, they don't have the capability for space flight. They might have done in the past, but they don't now.
What do they look like? I mean, as opposed to the Greys or something.
I suppose similar to the Greys, but not. They're I would call them like cousins of the Greys, but they are not the Greys, and they don't identify with the Greys.
Okay. So what does the future for remote viewing look like?
I think there's still going to be a place for research. There's still going to be a place for teaching remote viewing and similarly, but I like to think of the future as applications work, projects, putting it to work. And that's been my goal now for several years, doing the work myself, people contacting me to do projects. And I'm also teaching other people how to do it.
That's in Boulder City, Nevada, correct?
It's in Boulder City, Nevada, yes.
Could you talk just a little bit about the classes that you give and the?
Sure, I have two different kinds of classes. One is a 3-day weekend class called a master class, remote viewing master class. And as I mentioned before, 2 of the days are to bring new viewers and even experienced viewers back up to speed with remote viewing, with projects and instruction. And then the 3rd day, I throw a real project at them. They work as a team, and we do 3 sessions during the day. The first one blind, just from a coordinate, and the viewers do their own sessions, then come together, share their information, analyze it, put it up on a whiteboard. So we use just white sheets of paper. And then I will give them a little bit of what's called feedback, which is, yes, you're correct. This is an event and a location. Describe the event and the location. They'll go and do a second session. Then they'll come back again. This all takes place during one day. They come back with their information, again, do some analysis, write it all up. And then I will give them a question. I say, you're correct with your information that this was a fire in a cathedral, which you've identified as Notre Dame. What the client wants to know is, was this deliberate or some other cause, accidental or terrorist? What was the cause of the fire? Because by this time, they've got some really valid information. They go do a 3rd session and come back. And what this particular group, I'm just talking about one training group right now, they came back and said, no, this was accidental. It was an electrical box that should have been watched. It sparked and it started the fire. Now, this was tasked, or the project was given to us by a French professor from just outside Paris. And he's been sending me feedback from Paris. And it seems that that is now the preferred cause, that this was not terrorist related, it was not somebody setting fires, that it was quite likely an electrical malfunction that caused this. So we get feedback, and that's very gratifying.
Yeah, what implications does remote viewing have for human consciousness? I mean, I know there's research and training, but on the human consciousness level, where does remote viewing go?
It opens up the mind to out of the box thinking. I prefer to think there's no box. Right. We've created boxes, as Ingo Swann had written about, boxes within boxes. We limit ourselves by what society and education and religion, etc., imposes on us. Remote viewing opens up the individual to much, much more. That once they've done training, they go, wow, now I can go and get this information. I can go find missing people. I can do cases. So it adds another dimension to life, is what I think of, which we always had, but which we've lost.
So the place now that you're specifically giving courses is in Boulder City?
No, I go out to other locations. For example, in June, if it's safe to do so and safe to fly, I'm going out to North Carolina to the Rhine Research Institute to give a weekend class. And then in September, I'm going over to the UK and giving a series of classes in Nottingham. So I do travel to other locations, but the main base is here in Nevada.
Okay. In the book Seer, you broke your life into 3 parts, and the last part was your shamanic practitioner, or practicing shamanic work. And I know you're on that path where you've been a shamanic practitioner. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, yeah. I think I always was a shaman. Perhaps I was a shaman in a past life, who knows? I had an affinity towards the runes. There's a series of symbols, symbolic glyphs, much like, say, the Egyptians had the picture writing that came out of, the runes came out of Northern Europe. I discovered them in my 30s, and I felt so familiar with them that I've been working with them ever since. I will bring them out if I'm doing a remote viewing session and I'm stuck somewhere, and I'll use them for a particular use. I don't give readings as such, except I'll sometimes do a birthday reading for somebody. I'll write it up and put it into a little scroll with a ribbon, and that's a birthday gift or a Christmas gift. So I don't commercially do rune reading, but it's another tool that I use. So I'd been doing that for some time, and then I heard about a group that was teaching at Esalen Institute, Vision Seekers, with Hank Wesselman and Gell Kuykendall. And a friend had gone and just was raving about it. So I was so curious. I thought, I'd love to do that. I'd love to go and learn about shamanism, because I've always had a love of the earth, nature, the rocks, the sea, the ocean. I need to go and learn about this. So I went through a whole series of classes with Vision Seekers, some of them at Esalen in California, which is a wonderful place. I'd always wanted to go there, and some more up in Sonoma, at a ranch in Sonoma. And it was just adding another rich layer to my life. That's the only way I can describe it.
Right.
I now do shamanic work sort of quietly. I don't always include it with my remote viewing. I do some shamanic healing. I do some what's called psychopomp work, which I don't like that word. Basically, assisting souls to pass over. And I'll give you one example of that.
Yeah, please do.
One time, I have in my sacred garden, it's a virtual garden where I can go to do my shamanic work. I have a waiting room which borders on the afterlife. There's a door and a window. I can't go through, but I can see what's happening. And I'll often find souls there waiting. And a few years ago, I felt, I need to go check out the waiting room. Found it full of young sailors, soldiers, airmen who had committed suicide.
Wow.
But I don't know if you know the numbers. It's really been horrific. So I said, why haven't you passed over? Why have you come? Why have you found me? They said, well, we were scared. And like, why are you scared? Well, they were fearful of judgment, of lots of mixed emotions, guilt and anger and longing to go back, and fearful about judgment if they went over to the next life. I said, there is no judgment. There will be a life review when you pass over, which is for your learning, for your education. It's not a judgment. You can go through the door and you can go on. So they went, and for a while there was a whole flux of them. Now it's getting less.
So in other words, you helped to transition them from
Yes.
from this world to the spirit world.
Right.
And when you say virtual world, how do you describe that?
It's a representation, a virtual representation. I don't look in any kind of device. This is just internal within myself.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because I've dreamt a specific room that looked like a sauna, where relatives of mine were waiting in a room. All the people have passed on, and they were waiting there, and I didn't know what to do or what to say. I just saw them in that room.
Yeah. Yeah. There are souls that have a hard time passing over. Yeah. Or maybe they were there just to meet you.
So if you look at your life now, all the things that you've accomplished and all the different types of people you've met, what's your next venture, or what do you see yourself doing within the next 5 years?
Well, oh gosh. Well, continuing to write. I have a lot more books.
Right.
I want to continue teaching, basically doing more of the same. I don't know if Boulder City will be my last place of residence. I'm always open. I've been here almost 2 decades now in Nevada. So actually a little bit more than that now, because it was 92 when I came. Wow. Yeah, time goes on. And so I think doing more of the same. I'm always open to new ventures. I would love to be involved in remote viewing on these new off-planet, to the stars ventures, remote viewing potential locations, etc., etc. I just remain open to opportunities and to new ventures.
So you've had the whole gamut. You've had as we said at the very beginning, your feet have been on the ground, I guess, through the shamanic practice, and your head has been in the clouds, with remote viewing at different moments.
Yes.
So it's very interesting. Very interesting concept. Where do you see the remote viewing going with regards to outer planetary viewing? will there be new breakthroughs that you could speak about, or anything that?
It's still early days. Yeah, remote viewing, the two fields of remote viewing and the UFO field are just barely merging right now. There were some early merges, from Ed Dames, who was one of the Stargate viewers, that worked there. And then there was this taboo for a long time about off-planet stuff or anything to do other than just the standard orthodox, I call it the orthodox remote viewing. So it's very early days. I would like to see an expansion of that, because we are, as humans, looking at the stars now, instead of looking at the ground. So I'd like to be involved in that in some way as a remote viewer.
Do you think there'll ever be a confirmation from the government to the general public?
Well, Scott Jones, who was my co-author, Dr. Jones has been involved with the UFO field, with many, many anomalous fields for many years. He's now quite elderly. He's in assisted living now. But what his theory is, there has always been disclosure.
Right.
It's now just being validated. So I like to think of that, because we've always known there were UFOs. There are always people talking about their encounters and their involvement with ETs, but it's now just being openly validated. So I think in those terms, rather than there being some big disclosure.
Okay. Is there anything else that you'd like to share about anything that you're going to be doing, or about remote viewing itself?
Just that we have an organization, the International Remote Viewing Association, that's always looking for members. They have a wonderful website with lots of resources if you're interested in remote viewing, www.irva.org. We were going to have our 20th anniversary conference this year, but we've had to postpone it because of the coronavirus cautions, let's put it that way at the moment, because we didn't want to put people at risk. The board decided, it wasn't my decision, there was a board decision to postpone it till the fall. So we will be having our 20th anniversary conference in the fall in Las Vegas.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've asked you all the information that I've been interested in asking. If there's anything else further you'd like to share.
Just that we're living in very interesting times.
Yeah.
And I used to get very upset at some of the things that were happening in the US. I am a US citizen. I'm British born, but I'm a US citizen. So I am very involved. And I've come to the conclusion that I am just going to observe and assist where I can. I think things are going to get worse before they're going to get better. So that's the only thing I can say.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to thank you very much for spending this time with myself and my viewers. And you truly are an inspiring mind with a very great past and a great future ahead. So I thank you for joining with me today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on the show.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Thank you.
I look to speaking to you again in the future about other topics that relate
Sure.
to this.
I'd be happy to. Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. With Angela Thompson Smith. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too.